Welcome to Redirect Immigration Law and Perspectives. We're just going to have to start calling it semi-weekly dive into the world of immigration law and its human consequences. I'm your host, Stephen Robbins, and I'm joined by co-host, fellow immigration attorney, mostly good guy, Matthew.
Mostly. And that's I think kind of what we all should strive for, is to be mostly good. I mean, let's not set the bar too
It's
high.
one of those situations, the less you know him, the better he seems. So
Exactly. That's why I'm not on every week.
Matthew, how are you?
How am I?
Yeah.
You know what? I don't know. I'm okay. Okay. It's this whole Biden thing. Have we even done a show since the insurrection? It didn't seem like it.
What year is this? Yeah,
I'm not even sure.
We've done a lot of shows, actually. Matthew, are you okay?
No, it's just everything is a weird thing, right? You know, we thought post-Trump, I think we were expecting a few things. And would you say you're satisfied, disappointed? It's where you kind of expected things to be?
Well, I really want to be fair-minded because I do think that there's this whole thing online. It's sort of a Twitter phenomenon, but it's a branding of left-wingism, I guess. People on the left they want to figure out a way to tie everything back to Nancy Pelosi. And that's just the extent of their analysis, that the Democrats are bad. And they are, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it feels a little unfair and short-sighted, a little shallow. So I do want to be fair, but at the same time, balanced, fair and balanced.
Wow.
I think,
we should try that out as a new slogan, fair and balanced.
Yeah. We report, you decide. Does anyone have that?
We'll leave it to the fans.
Okay. So here's the deal. My big thing is the sort of misrepresentations that have been made that make me feel like we're being played a little bit, right? So there have been some good things, but for example, let's talk about the enforcement priorities first. Day one, the inauguration is this big pomp and circumstance thing, but then he gets right to work. He sits down at the Resolute desk, signs a bunch of executive orders, and one of them is a new enforcement priority executive order talking about who should be considered an enforcement priority for ICE, and also a 100-day pause on deportations. We had Alina Das on. So yes, we have done a show since the insurrection. And she said the 100-day pause was even more ambitious than the Bernie Sanders proposed pause. So, you and I think for a minute there, were thinking, all right, this is pretty good. But then it turns out the actual memos released by ICE just this last week, it's taken this long to actually trickle down into, actual policy, are far less ambitious. I mean, they basically just ignore the executive order.
Well, I mean,
they're still good. They're better than the Trump's enforcement priorities. They're better. But it just leaves me with this feeling of what was that whole thing? It was...
Well, the 100-day moratorium, right, has been enjoined from a court down in Texas. So a lot of people will jump on that to say, oh, well, you can't blame Biden. There's this Judge Tipton down in Texas. But they've done very little, it seems, to kind of push back against that and to fight against that. So, and along with the 100-day moratorium was all the enforcement priorities. And under Trump, the way it worked, when enforcement priorities dropped, as soon as they hit deportation officers' desks and government attorneys' desks, they were implemented. They did not need any explanation. They did not need any guidance. We went from, hey, we can give your guy prosecutorial discretion, to 30 seconds later to, nope, we can't do that.
Right. Just to put a fine point on that, we had pending requests for administrative closure, which is basically where the ICE prosecutors take your case and agree to have it shelved, right? We're not going to spend our time having your guy removed because he's a single dad and his daughter, needs a heart transplant or whatever, right? Circumstances like that, or less. Not that your daughter needs to have a heart transplant necessarily, but And we had pending requests, and literally, yeah, you're right. Like literally the day, and it was in February 2017 that Trump said, everyone's a priority now. I started responding to those going like, yeah, we can't do that anymore because of this memo.
Yeah. And this time around, I reached out to ICE for different cases for people who were detained. And their universal response was, oh, we have to wait for guidance.
Right.
And then I would push back and say, hey, all the guidance is right here. Actually, a deportation officer saying, yeah, your guy that you're talking about is not a priority. He's not a priority under these guidelines. However, we determine that we're going to keep him detained. And it's like, well, what's the point? So we're waiting for the guidelines. We're waiting for the guidelines to put a little bit more meat behind these things. And then we get the guidelines that say, yes, here are the priorities. You guys use your own discretion. Whatever. And we're going to see, because they just dropped on, I guess, Thursday or Friday. I can't remember. So we'll wait to see how ICE views them. I mean, there is better language than was Trump, but still a little deflating.
Right. Again, it's this thing where, like, if these enforcement priorities had been the day one drop, we'd probably be satisfied. I mean, not completely, obviously. We'd still be pushing for more aggressive measures, but it wouldn't leave us with this sense of like, what was that whole thing that you did if that's not going to end up being the actual policy? Now, there's this idea that ICE is a rogue agency. They can't be tamed. And that seems a little bit completely wrong.
Yeah, I mean, are they trying? First of all, I don't buy into ICE as a rogue agency. ICE does what they do, right? I mean, that's what they do. But yeah, I mean, you have to have leadership, right? You have to have people on top who say, no, this is what you're going to do. And I guess, there are reports that morale is low at ICE and ERO because they can't do their job. As they're saying. Can you imagine, like, they're the biggest babies of any workforce that you're telling them, okay, you know what? You no longer have to go out at 5 o'clock in the morning to like break down someone's door and like rip a father away from their family while their children are crying. You think if that was me, I'd be like, you know what? That's cool. So we get to sit around and like drink coffee until 10 and do some paperwork and all that. But no, they're mad about that stuff. It's crazy to me.
Yeah. And the thing about, right, there is work for them to do. Like,
unfortunately, yeah.
There are people, for example, who've been convicted multiple times for drug trafficking and human trafficking or whatever, who make their way back to the United States. There's drug routes, these Mexican drug cartels, like the next generation of Jalisco cartel. They have routes into the United States. And if I were an ICE agent who'd spent the last 4 years, like you said, rolling up on regular people with no criminal history, and then the next administration came around and said, why don't we focus on people posing a danger to communities? I don't know. It seems weird that I would be upset about that, but...
And you wonder how upset they really are because,
right.
They have the ICE union, which doesn't represent all ICE agents. I think it represents not a majority of them, but they're very political. And, a lot of this stuff gets leaked out to organizations like FAIR and like CIS. So,
right.
You wonder, but it'd be interesting to see how they begin to operate. And one thing I remember under Obama that was one of the positive was that you always had a somewhat friendly voice kind of above your local people in DC, or there were people on the upper levels that would be more sympathetic. Under Trump, right, it was you got a bad decision from your local office. You weren't going to get any better going up to DC or anything. So right. Hopefully that kind of trickles down to them. But there are a lot of other things, right, that are kind of easy that have not been done. I know you were talking to Curtis last week about some of the visa ban stuff, but MPP is coming to an end. It seems like it's kind of a slow rollout of the end there. But there are a lot of people in detention that he could just order released. I mean, it's not beyond his powers.
Right. I've got a guy right now who's been detained since August, and it's on an old weed conviction. He's subject to mandatory detention. And, they could release a policy saying like anybody detained for marijuana possession, they get to have their custody reviewed by ICE. Very simple thing. It's really weird to drive by half a dozen weed shops on the way to my office and then work with this guy.
Drive by, right.
You know what I mean? Drive by, stop at, make purchases. I'm just kidding. So it's weird. And the other thing about ICE being a rogue agency in defense of ICE, in their defense, when they say, hey, like, we're just enforcing the law, on the one hand, they're ignoring the fact that like they're allowed to make discretionary decisions and they don't have to do a lot of the stuff that they say they have to do. But on the other hand, like, it's also true that they are enforcing a set of really bad laws, like the mandatory detention thing I just mentioned, or these other things. And so it's not a good excuse, in my opinion, when they're also vested with the power to make discretionary decisions. But it's also true, also, that we need to change the structure of the laws that they're enforcing and take the teeth out of a lot of these things. And that gets us, I guess, to immigration reform.
Yeah, the big Biden proposal.
Now, I want to say one thing before we get into the big Biden proposal, which was supposed to drop on day one. We're coming up on month 2, but that's okay. Maybe they needed time. I'm willing to grant them that. This is the U.S. Citizenship Act. It was released last week. And I did want to put a little disclaimer on it. Matthew and I are immigration lawyers. People pay us for our services when they need to get papers or avoid deportation. I had a nephew who claimed during the 2016 election that I only opposed Trump because he was going to be bad for business. And for me personally,
gotcha.
He totally nailed me. And that was it. That was my main reason for opposing Trump. No, but Trump was actually pretty good for business, not in a way that I'm happy about, right? So
it's like how COVID is good for like ER doctors.
Right. Well, actually, my friend's an ER doctor. He said COVID was not good for business.
Well, it's good for some healthcare professionals, right?
Right.
Like in New York City, those nurses getting a lot of shifts. They must be raking in the overtime.
OT, right.
Yeah, they must be like high-fiving each other.
So lucky.
Thank God for COVID.
No, but Trump, in terms of the business side, took away things like initial DACA applications. So that's a lot of, for us, money and potential clients left on the table. But a lot more people were put in removal proceedings. And so in some ways, my practice shifted, but was still quite lucrative. So I don't want people to think that we are excited about an immigration reform because of how much business there will be in it. I'm already basically at capacity. I don't know how I would even deal with more people qualifying for things. So
yeah, I mean, we can talk about who knows, well, one, what gets enacted, but how it would really affect our business, because like you said with Trump, things came in that didn't come in before and things didn't come in. So, if we'll get into the proposal, but it could be a whole lot of stuff that we're doing now we're not going to be doing, like removal work.
Right.
And maybe we're just processing, hopefully we're just kind of processing applications for people to get really good benefit. But how much can you charge for that as opposed to whatnot? So I don't look at it from a business side. I look at it as how many people is it going to be able to help?
Right. I just think it's important for people to know, like when we're talking about this, at least in my case, and I think in your case too, that business calculation is really not coming into it. And in fact, I read some of this proposal and thought this could actually remove a lot of potential clients from my normal workload, right? And maybe it could even be detrimental, possibly in the long term, to the type of business that we do. But that's a good thing.
Well, I mean, it could.
A good thing. So
the way we're reading it, and before we get into the nitty gritty, how do you feel about what you've seen? What are your general feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as good as you could hope for from an administration like this. We've always joked about how the Democrats would come out with an immigration reform that's like, okay, you get a 4-year work permit that vests into a 3-month voluntary departure, or something like that, and only 5 people qualify for it, and that's their idea of comprehensive immigration reform. But this actually seems pretty good. It's broader than I would have expected in a lot of ways, and does include more people than I would have thought. I also think, I don't know if this is on purpose, it does seem to be severable in the sense that, like, I think that there's chunks that could be taken out and passed on their own. We've talked about doing immigration reform piecemeal and not in a comprehensive bill. And it seems like it's almost designed to say, like, maybe we've hit a wall on some aspect of the bill. Well, we're just going to pull out the farm worker part, or the DREAM Act, and we're going to try and get 2 or 3 of these things done, which is really smart. So,
yeah, I think I'm with you. I'm kind of impressed with maybe the aggressiveness on some of this. Mm-hmm. To put a date as to January 1st of 2021, I think is really ambitious. And what I'm saying is that a lot of this being ability to get lawful status is based on being here since January 1st of 2021.
Which is not that long.
It's not very long ago.
What would you have expected? 10 years or at least 5, right?
Yeah, 5.
Yeah.
They always talked about 5 years. And that might be one of those conscious, like, okay, we're going to put this in with the realization that we might have to roll it back.
Right.
So another disclaimer, none of this is law. So if you're listening to this and we're just talking about what they're proposing. So another disclaimer, if you think you're going to hear any talk about real employment stuff, you're not going to hear it here.
Yeah, sorry.
So there are stuff for employment-based things. And Amy Maldonado, friend of the show, says they suck.
She's not real thrilled.
not real thrilled. But they do the January 1st, 2021 date was kind of surprising and good. And also, they actually lessen the criminal stuff. Usually with these things, we expect that criminal situations would be dealt with harsher. I was kind of expecting one DUI is mandatory detention and things like that. But for the people who do criminal immigration, there's a lot of like good things in here. So that was kind of surprising. And they repealed the 3 and 10-year bar as well as a permanent ban.
Right.
Exempts false claim to citizenship for people who were under 21 at the time of the misrepresentation. That's a huge deal because there are people who would have come over when they're like 10 years old using a cousin's U.S. passport, and they're dinged with it, and they're never able to get status because of that. That makes no sense. So at least they're addressing that.
Like if you go get a job, you got to fill out an I-9.
Oh, yeah.
And ask you if you're a citizen or a lawful permanent resident. And if you were like raised here, you speak perfect English, you don't have an accent, and you go to apply at like Arby's or whatever, and you get that form. If you say you're a permanent resident, you've got to produce a green card. Well, if you're undocumented, you don't have a green card. So they don't require proof of citizenship. You just have to mark the box. So a lot of young people, in order to get just a basic job, end up marking that box and disqualifying themselves for life from getting a green card because you worked at Arby's for a week and then you hated it and you quit or whatever. According to the current immigration laws, that's a lifetime ban, no waiver. And I've had to tell a lot of people, sorry about that, but there's nothing we can do. So
just one more little thing before we get into real substance is that spouses and children, they all can apply on the same application, which, people say, well, why is that such a big deal? Currently, if a family is applying for their permanent residency, the husband has to send in an application, the wife has to send an application, and their children, and it gets expensive. It really does.
Yeah, the filing fee is $1,225 without a lawyer for a single green card application. So yeah, we've had families of 4 or 5, for example, and before you know it, they're 10 grand in on filing fees alone.
And I know what happened with, I don't know, you might not have had this experience because you're a little younger. People under the last amnesty I've dealt with, there was always like one person that didn't get included because the family couldn't afford it. And then something happened, they went on with life, and then they were put into a terrible situation later. So I think that's one of the little things that can, I think potentially be a big deal. But let's get on to a new status that they're going to create, or they want to create, is a lawful prospective immigration status, LPI. So now we'll have some new initials for us. And that would be, if you meet the requirements, you get a work permit for 6 years. You can travel with that work permit, which is a big deal.
Right.
You can't get any ACA benefits. They had to put that in.
Right.
Had to make sure that was in there. You can enlist in the armed forces.
You can serve in the army, but if you get sick, you're going to die. So sorry. It's a balancing act. I mean, I know I've mentioned this before, but that's maybe the number one question we get in my area of practice, where we have people who've been here 15, 20, 30 years, undocumented.
Yeah, well, it's work permit, travel, and driver's license, right?
Right. And in Washington, we have driver's licenses. Okay. So that's not such a big deal here. But every week, I'm getting 4 or 5 people who they've got a pending application, or they are totally undocumented, but their mother is sick back in Mexico, or somebody passed away. They want to go see their family and they just can't.
Right. You have people in lawful status, right? Like visa status.
Right. There are people with papers. And even with DACA, you now, thanks to a convoluted web of lawsuits and whatnot, you can apply for a permit to leave and come back. But that's sort of a long and expensive process. So if you just telling people who are undocumented, the thing about undocumented people is typically they're already working. So a work permit is good, and it gives them flexibility in being able to find better jobs. But the travel permit is such a huge thing for people to just have the basic dignity of being able to see their family, right? That would be amazing.
Yeah, that is a big deal. So after 5 years, you can apply for your green card. You have to be tax compliant with your federal taxes. That's what they say. So that's kind of like the long range way to go about it. Now, another thing, once you get your permanent residency status, they're actually shortening the time period from 5 years to 3 years.
Nice. So 8 years total to be able to apply for your citizenship.
Yes. So now there's the DREAM Act.
Wait, let me ask you, do there appear to be criminal bars?
Yeah, I didn't really go through all the same. I think it's the same type of bars that we have right now, the criminal bars. The 3 and 10 year bar has been taken out. The permanent bar has been taken out.
But if you get caught, stabbing someone or dealing drugs, you're off the path to citizenship, basically, I'm assuming.
Probably. Now, since you bring it up, we can bring up the criminal stuff. Because right now there's something called a petty offense exception, that it's basically a minor crime that has a sentence of less than a year. 1. If you have one of those, it can kind of be exempted. Now it's going to be 2. So then you can think of things like shoplifting, usually kind of fall into that category. But what they're going to do for the criminal stuff is really important, is they're going to redefine what a conviction is. So right now, basically, if you plead guilty in front of a judge, that's a conviction. That's as shorthand as I can give it to you. If you get that conviction expunged, that doesn't mean anything. It's still a conviction. Sometimes you have deferred adjudication. You go to a judge, you say, I'm guilty. And the judge says, okay, you do 2 years of probation and do this. You do that, you come back, and the conviction, the judgment is withdrawn. That's still a conviction. The proposal is that if there's an adjudication of guilt that is dismissed or expunged or deferred or invalidated or withheld or vacated later on, that is no longer a conviction.
Right.
And so, as I get too into the weeds, it's actually really a really positive thing, because there are so many people, non-citizens, who will take a plea and they'll plead guilty, they'll do their probation classes or whatnot, and then they don't have a conviction for state purposes, but they'll have it for immigration. So that will I think they're trying to put everyone on the same playing field, which I think is a good thing. And another really important thing is the term of imprisonment is basically if you're in prison. So it's not suspended sentences or things like that. So example, you have a theft offense, you get time served, which was like that night that you spent in prison, and then 2 years suspended sentence.
Right.
Well, that's an aggravated felony. You'll never spend that time in jail if you do what you're supposed to do, but they take that as 2 years in prison, so it makes it an aggravated felony. Under the new law, if it passes, that would not be. So those are big, big deals when we're talking about the criminal stuff. So I think the answer is there are still the same type of criminal bars, but
a little more flexibility.
A little bit more flexibility. That's so good. Now there's the DREAM Act. So there are two parts to the DREAM Act portion. Under this section, you can apply directly for adjustment of status. So the first part is if you're under 18 at entry, you have a high school diploma or a GED, college, military, or you've earned income for at least 3 years in 75% of the time that you've had a work permit. So if someone came in when they're 16 years old, they didn't go to high school and get their GED, they just started working, they got a work permit through DACA or another way, maybe through an asylum application or whatnot. And it can show that they've had income for 3 years and 75% of the time they had their EAD, they can apply directly for their green card. Right. Then there is a waiver for all of that for compelling circumstances. For example, you think of someone who is a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad.
Right.
Some other reason why they haven't worked. So
I wish that all of immigration law was just a compelling circumstance waiver. Like we could just write a letter and just be like, hey, he's a good dude.
Exactly.
It really should be. It really should be like that. But.
Now, and then also like DACA TPS, people who are on DACA or have temporary protected status, they're in the same realm that they can apply directly for permanent residency. And then also there's an agricultural worker adjustment status. I know that you're probably more excited about as you deal with people like that a little more than I do. So,
yeah,
but it's good. I mean, I think there's positive. Now, there are negatives, right? There are things that we want. There's really no provisions in there about detention, so to speak. Again, some of the criminal stuff will lessen the amount of mandatory detention because people aren't going to be zinged with aggravated felonies and convictions as much. But still, you know, I would have liked to see an end to mandatory detention. Just like, first, I'd like to see an end to detention. Okay. But if we have detention, I think everyone should have the ability to make their case for bond.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I think that is something that is kind of missing from there. Also, there's other things in the criminal stuff. If you were convicted and the judge makes a finding that you shouldn't be deported, that can be a consideration as well. So there's probably a lot of stuff in here for criminal defense attorneys that would be good for them. But getting stuff expunged is a big deal, right? Because you ever have a client who had stuff expunged and you're like, why? Because now it makes it harder to get the records and it doesn't do anything about their case.
Right.
But now that would be a good thing.
Right.
So, you know, I think there are a lot of good things here. Oh, it repeals the 1 year deadline for asylum. So,
oh man.
For asylum, you have to apply within 1 year of coming into the United States of your last entry in order to be eligible. That's no longer the case. And they have an interesting thing. They put in a 2 year period to file a motion to reopen. If you were denied solely for the 1 year thing, you had gotten withholding of removal, not an LPR, and there's no safe third country, and you were not denied because of discretion. So there are some, you know, positive things. And there's a lot more in there that we're not going to touch on. But
it seems like there's less of the sort of traditional trade-offs of...
Well, there's not really enforcement. That's like the criticism of it.
On the right.
Right. And I'm glad they did that because now there's negotiating room, right?
Right. And even the thing, like you said, the physical presence required, saying, you know what, the date is January 1st of this year. That gives them room to say like, okay, we can move it back to the 5 years, which means a significantly a smaller portion of people will qualify. But, they gave themselves that room instead of starting out negotiating against themselves, which is sort of standard.
Classic.
Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because you ever buy like a Powerball when it's at like 500 million or?
Yeah. Are you waiting for the numbers to come out? Is that it?
No, you want to kind of have those couple days where you get to just think about, what am I going to do? Well, and it's not going to happen, but it feels kind of good. So
yeah, I've had conversations with people and said, just give yourself a little bit of time just to kind of imagine, will you? And your mind starts to go through, in my case, clients and friends who like this could really help. Like there's a provision that if you were deported under Trump, there's a path back for you.
Right.
So that's kind of we have a good friend in Peru who was deported under Trump. And, his family's here in the United States and he would be a great candidate. And it's exciting to think like maybe that's a thing.
Right.
Now, the likelihood of all of this getting passed, I think, is probably 0, right?
It seems pretty low.
They're not going to get rid of the filibuster. I think Joe Manchin won't let them get rid of the filibuster. And you wonder if they had 50 votes anyways.
Right. There's a lot of those questions. Here's what I would say for now. Can you hear the baby crying in the background?
It's so annoying.
Oh,
man.
Here's what I would say. Like, for now, I hope that we can sort of bury the cynicism deep down into our soul, and we'll revisit it. Don't get me wrong. But for now, there are local groups, I'm sure, in your area that have organized in support of immigrant rights in the past, and they might have actions relating to this bill planned. Call them, find out how can I get involved, if they have scripts for calling your representatives. And we got to just like flood the phone lines, plan demonstrations or whatever in order to show that it has support, because it is, for a lot of those representatives or senators, politically, it's pretty bold and it's pretty risky. And so those people need to know that there is a constituency for it, right? If all of us who think it's great sit at home and do nothing, just convinced that it's not going to happen, then we've sort of sealed our own fate.
So what do you think of all those polls that have this like really high percentage of Americans who agree there should be some pathway to citizenship? I don't really trust them, but your take on it.
I don't know. The thing I see with immigration is the people who are against something like this or immigration in general are either white nationalists. They would reject that label, but like that's just the truth. They're worried about like demographic shift and all these things that mean they're worried about the browning of the country, basically, or just foreigners in general. Or they're people who have no idea how broken the system is. We've talked about those people before. They're the people who come in because their maid got detained. And how could that possibly be? She's such a good maid. And what can I do to fix it? And we have to tell those people, like, this is the way that the system is. And so I don't know where that leaves, the rest of the population on a poll.
Yeah. You do worry that with Republicans, since a lot of them their margins are so slim within their own party, that the anti-immigrant forces, they are strong. Right. So
just real quick, because my congressman came out against it. He voted for impeachment. He's a Republican. And he's been spending the last month trying to prove how MAGA he is and to his core. And he said that this is open borders. It's not. It doesn't apply to, I guess there's a provision about people who were deported under Trump, but there's certainly nothing that would open the floodgates to future illegal immigration. And then I think he probably also said it was socialism or something like that. So
yeah, of course.
But we just have to be ready, I guess, to engage with those quote unquote ideas. But I don't know. It's encouraging. So
yeah, I mean, at least they're going bigger than I thought. Of course, if me and you were putting this stuff together, right, it would look different, but no one's ever going to let us do that. So
I know. It's too bad.
And again, this is not law. So
I've already had a handful of calls of people saying, will I qualify for it? And I'll say, it is not it yet. It will change. And also it might not pass. And then they'll say, okay, but if it passes, will I qualify? And we just don't know, right? The contours will change and it's not a lot. And I guess the last thing about that, if you are involved in community activism or any of that stuff in the immigrant community, make sure that you're reiterating to people, there's nothing to sign up for. There's nothing to be paying retainers for. There are unscrupulous attorneys and other types of parties in the community who inevitably will come out and try and take advantage of an environment like the one we have now.
$1,500 retainer, just to get in line. It's going to be a big line, so you want to make sure you're first.
When the amnesty hits, my resources are going to be really stretched very thin, and so you want to make sure that, you hear all kinds of things like that, and it's nonsense. So don't fall for it. If something passes, there will be plenty of time for you to find out if you qualify and to hire somebody who's trustworthy to help you if that's required. So everybody just chill out.
That's right. So our first Sunday show.
You know the show Meet the Press with Chuck Todd?
Oh, yeah.
Their slogan, you hear these commercials for this show. Their slogan is, if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press. It was a funny slogan because all it's saying about the show is what day it's on.
And it doesn't indicate that it actually sucks. It's a bit more truth.
If it's Friday, we might be recording our podcast. That should be our tagline. All right. Good talking to you.
All right, Stephen.
Adios.
You stay fine.
You too.